I can do that, but one key input is missing. The exact final title you want me to use. Please paste the locked title verbatim, and I'll write part 1 in one single English block inside one pair of brackets exactly as requested. The hall had gone so quiet that even the lantern flames seemed to hold their breath. Mara stood near the back pillar with her hands folded, her head bowed, and her heart beating so hard it made her ribs ache. She had learned long ago how to become small in a room full of people who preferred not to see her. Tonight was no different. The silver tables were crowded with polished goblets, fragrant meats, and women draped in silk that caught the firelight like water. Yet Mara felt more alone than she had in the deepest winter woods. Across the hall, Lord Varric spoke to the pack with an easy smile, as if every person there belonged to him. His eyes passed over Mara once, then again, and the look that followed was full of lazy amusement. "Still hiding in the shadows, Mara," he said, loud enough for the room to hear. A few wolves chuckled. Her cheeks warmed, but she kept her face still. The servants nearby looked away. No one stepped forward. No one ever did. Mara lowered her gaze to the floor polished smooth by years of careful hands and tried to steady her breathing. Then a movement near the far doors caught her attention. A man entered without ceremony, cloaked in dark wool, one shoulder damp from the evening mist. He moved with the quiet certainty of someone used to being obeyed, yet no one seemed to recognize him. The guards at the door only straightened and let him pass. Something in the air changed when he stepped inside. Mara could not name it, but it stirred deep in her chest, like a distant memory of thunder before rain. The man paused beside the threshold, his gaze sweeping the hall once. When his eyes found Mara, he did not look through her the way the others did. He looked at her as if he had been searching for her. Her fingers tightened around the edge of her sleeve. She did not know why that simple glance made her feel suddenly exposed, as though the whole room had vanished and only the two of them remained. Lord Varric noticed the stranger a moment later. His smile thinned. "You are late," he said, with the irritation of someone speaking to a lesser man. "State your name." The stranger did not answer at once. He removed his hood slowly, and the firelight caught the sharp line of his jaw, the calm of his eyes, the quiet strength in every still movement. A few murmurs moved through the hall. Mara felt them before she understood them. Recognition, fear, uncertainty. Yet the man only kept looking at her. Then, in a voice low and steady, he said, "She will not be spoken to like that again." The words were simple. They were not loud, but they landed across the hall with the force of a decree. Mara lifted her head, her breath caught halfway between disbelief and hope. No one had ever spoken for her so plainly, so openly, as if her pain mattered enough to interrupt an entire room. Lord Varric gave a sharp laugh, but it sounded brittle now. The stranger took one more step forward, and the servants fell silent. His expression did not change, yet the power in that stillness was unmistakable. Mara felt it in her skin, in the hush pressing against her ears, in the way every wolf in the chamber seemed to remember something they had forgotten they knew. He stopped near the center of the hall, then turned slightly, just enough for everyone to see the insignia on the inside of his cloak. The room seemed to freeze. Mara did not know what she was seeing at first, only that the air had gone heavy with shock. Then the whisper began, trembling from mouth to mouth like fire through dry grass. "The king," someone breathed. "The Alpha King." Mara's pulse stumbled. Her eyes widened, and the world tilted once beneath her feet. The man who had looked at her as if she were the only soul in the room was not a stranger at all. He was the ruler of the Western Pax, the one whose name was spoken carefully, almost reverently, by men who feared his judgment and women who prayed never to need it. And he had walked in here for her. Not for Lord Varric, not for the feast, for her. When he turned back to Mara, the hardness in the room seemed to melt around his voice. "Come here," he said, not as a command, but as an offer no one dared refuse. Mara did not move at first. The Alpha King's words hung in the room like a held breath, gentle and impossible all at once. Every eye had turned toward her, and she could feel the heat of that attention crawling up her skin. A moment ago, she had been a servant standing at the edge of a feast, easy to ignore and easier to dismiss. Now the silence itself seemed to belong to her. Lord Varric had gone pale. He stood rigid beside the table, his mouth opening and closing as if he had lost the ability to form a proper sentence. Mara did not look at him. She could not. Her gaze remained fixed on the man by the doorway, on the dark lines of his cloak, on the steady calm in his face that made the whole room seem smaller than it was. He had not raised his voice. He did not need to. The power in him moved quietly, the way deep water moved beneath ice. When he held out his hand again, it was not the hand of a conqueror demanding surrender. It was the hand of someone offering shelter. Mara's throat tightened. She had spent so long learning how not to ask for anything, how to fold herself into corners and apologize for taking up space. The thought of stepping forward felt almost impossible. Her feet remained rooted to the floor, and for one terrible second, she feared that everyone in the room could see how badly her heart was shaking. Then the Alpha King's gaze softened, only for her. "You are safe," he said, low enough that the words seemed meant for her alone. They reached her like warmth after a long winter. Mara blinked hard. She did not know why those 3 words hurt so much, only that they did. Safe. No one had said that to her in years. Not with honesty. Not like it mattered. The chandeliers above them threw pale light across the polished tables, across the stunned faces, across the spilled wine and untouched plates, but none of it touched the strange stillness settling inside her. It was as if the world had paused to listen for what she would do next. Lord Varric finally found his voice. "Your Majesty," he began, trying to sound smooth and failing. "There has been some mistake. The girl is only a servant." A few nervous laughs fluttered at the far end of the hall, thin and uncertain, the kind people made when they were desperate to agree with power without understanding it. Mara felt the old shame rise like a familiar tide. Her hands curled at her sides. The familiar instinct to lower her head, to disappear, came at once. But before she could give in to it, the Alpha King stepped forward. One measured step, then another. The room seemed to shrink around him. "Then you have forgotten," he said, his tone calm enough to be terrifying, "that servants are still people." The laughter died instantly. Mara's breath caught. She had never heard anyone speak that truth in a room like this, not where it mattered. Not where the people who most needed to hear it were standing close enough to be changed by it. The king's eyes remained on Varric, but his next words landed on everyone present. "And this one," he said, turning slightly so the whole hall could hear, "has been treated with more grace than many who wear silk and titles." Mara's chest ached. She did not know whether to look away or cry. No one had ever defended her so openly, so plainly, without asking what she could offer in return. The Alpha King extended his hand one last time, patient and certain, as though he had all the time in the world and had already decided the outcome. The hall waited. Mara waited too. Then, with a breath that trembled once before steadying, she lifted her hand and placed it in his. His fingers closed around hers with quiet strength, and at that simple touch, the room seemed to understand what it had almost missed. The servant they had overlooked was no one's shadow. She was the reason the king had come. And when the Alpha King led her away from the feast, every gaze in the hall followed them in stunned silence, as if history itself had just turned and chosen a new path. Mara kept her eyes on the path ahead as the king led her through the tall stone arches and into the quieter wing of the palace. The music from the feast faded behind them, swallowed by thick velvet walls and the soft whisper of torch flames. Her pulse had not settled yet. It still fluttered in her throat, fragile and bright, as if one wrong breath could break the moment into a memory she might not survive. She had expected the king to release her hand once they left the hall. Instead, he held on with the same calm certainty, his thumb resting once against her knuckles as though reminding her she was no longer alone. The corridor opened into a gallery lined with moonlit windows. Silver light poured across polished floors and painted every surface in a colder glow. Mara slowed. Her reflection moved beside his in the glass, small and unsure, while he stood beside her with the stillness of someone born to command entire worlds. At last, he stopped before a carved door and turned toward her. "You are trembling," he said, not unkindly. Mara tried to steady herself. "I am not used to being looked at," she admitted. The words came out softer than she meant, almost lost beneath the hush of the hall beyond. For a moment, the king said nothing. His gaze stayed on her face, patient and searching, as though he were learning a language no one else had bothered to hear. Then he opened the door and guided her inside. It was a private chamber, warm with firelight and lined with shelves of old books, folded maps, and framed portraits of rulers long gone. A wide window looked out over the palace gardens, where the silver leaves of the trees shone beneath the moon. Mara stood near the threshold, uncertain what to do with her hands, with her breath, with the impossible fact of being here at all. The king released her only after she had crossed the room, and even then, the absence of his hand felt strangely cold. He moved to the hearth and poured a cup of steaming tea from a silver pot that seemed already prepared for him. "You have not eaten enough," he said, setting the cup on a small table beside her. Mara looked at it, then at him. No one had ever cared whether she ate. No one had ever noticed when she skipped a meal, so someone else might have her portion. Her throat tightened in a way that made speech difficult. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, the question barely above a whisper. His expression did not change, but something deeper moved behind his eyes. "Because you should have been protected long before tonight." The answer struck her harder than any insult ever had. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was simple, absolute. He said it as though it were the most natural truth in the world. Mara lowered her gaze to the tea, watching the steam curl upward in pale ribbons. "They do not know me," she said. "They only know what they decided I was." "Then they were wrong," he replied. The king took one slow step closer, enough to make the air between them feel charged and careful. "I have seen enough to know the difference." Mara looked up before she could stop herself. "You barely know me. I know you stood in a hall full of wolves and did not look away when they tried to break you," he said. "I know you carried yourself with more grace than many who wear silk and titles. I know you did not beg for mercy. You did not ask to be chosen. Yet when I offered my hand, you trusted me." His voice lowered, steady as a vow. "That tells me more than 100 rumors ever could." The fire cracked softly between them. Mara felt the heat in her face, but it was not shame now. It was something stranger, something tender, something that made her chest ache with the fear of hope. She had learned long ago to mistrust kindness that arrived too quickly. It often came with strings, with conditions, with a hidden cost. But this man stood before her with neither impatience nor demand. Only attention, only patience, only a quiet power that made the room feel smaller and safer all at once. Outside the window, the moon rose higher above the gardens, silvering the leaves and bathing the chamber in a pale, dreaming light. The king followed her gaze, then looked back to her. "There is a custom in my court," he said. "When I choose to protect someone publicly, I also choose to know the truth privately. The truth of what was done to them. The truth of who stood by and who turned away." Mara's fingers tightened around the cup. The warmth steadied her. "And if the truth is ugly?" she asked. His answer came at once. "Then it deserves to be seen." The words settled into the room like a lantern being lit in the dark. Mara swallowed hard. For the first time in years, she felt the dangerous beginning of relief. Not because her pain had vanished, not because the past had been erased, but because someone powerful had seen it and refused to look away. The king studied her face for one long moment, then inclined his head toward the chair beside the fire. "Sit," he said gently. "Tell me everything." Mara hesitated only once before obeying, and as she lowered herself into the warmth of that quiet room, with the king standing watch beside the flame, she understood that the night had not ended with the feast. It had only begun to reveal who would stand with her when the whole world finally learned her name. The fire had burned low by the time Mara finished speaking, but the room felt warmer than before, as if the truth itself had settled into the walls and refused to leave. She sat with both hands wrapped around the cup the king had placed in her palms, still half convinced that kindness could vanish if she moved too quickly. Yet he did not rush her. He did not interrupt. He only stood near the hearth, one hand resting behind his back, listening with the kind of stillness that made a person feel safe enough to breathe again. Mara told him about the first lie, then the second, then the long chain of small cruelties that had slowly taught her to lower her eyes before anyone else could force them down. She spoke of the whispers in the kitchen halls, the careful way she had learned to walk, the moments when silence had become her only shield. Once or twice her voice caught, and each time the king's gaze remained on her, steady and unflinching, as if he were guarding something precious that the world had nearly broken. When she finally fell quiet, the silence between them was no longer empty. It was full, full of the things no one had ever allowed her to say, full of the grief she had carried alone, full of the strange, trembling relief that came from being believed. The king crossed the room then, slow enough that she would not feel cornered, and took the chair opposite her instead of the one beside her. It was a small choice, but Mara felt it immediately. He was meeting her where she was, not towering over her, not forcing her to be brave before she was ready. "You have carried this by yourself for too long," he said quietly. Mara looked down at her hands. "I did not know there was another way." His expression softened in a way that made her chest tighten. "There is," he said, "and tonight, you are no longer alone in it." The words were so simple that they hurt, not because they were sharp, but because they were true. Outside the window, the wind moved through the dark trees, brushing the glass like a warning from the world she had left behind. Yet inside the chamber, the night seemed to hesitate. Mara lifted her eyes to his face, searching for the smallest sign of pity, but found none. Only patience. Only a quiet strength that did not demand she shrink to make room for it. "Why are you helping me?" she asked at last, the question barely louder than the crackle of the embers. The king did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was low, measured, and certain, because no one who speaks with that much pain should ever be dismissed as if they are nothing. Mara felt the words land deep inside her, past the ache, past the fear, past the old instinct to believe she was asking for too much simply by existing. For the first time, the possibility of justice did not feel like a story told to comfort the powerless. It felt like something that might actually arrive. The king rose and moved to the door, pausing only to glance back at her. "Sleep here tonight," he said. "No one will disturb you." Mara's breath caught. Sleep. In a room where no one would mock her. In a place where her name was not spoken as an insult. The thought was almost unbearable in its gentleness. She nodded once, unable to trust her voice. He opened the door, then stopped when her hand tightened around the cup. "Your truth changes everything," he said, not as a threat, but as a promise. Mara watched him go, the door closing softly behind him, and in the hush that followed, she stared into the last gold glow of the fire and understood something that made her pulse quicken with equal parts fear and hope. The night had not brought her ruin. It had brought her to the edge of revelation. And somewhere beyond that fragile line, the whole kingdom was about to learn exactly who she was. Mara did not sleep. The room was too quiet for that, too still with the kind of silence that made every breath feel important. She sat in the low light near the dying fire, her hands wrapped around the cup he had left behind, listening to the old house settle around her like it was learning her shape. For the first time in years, no one was shouting for her to move faster, lower her eyes, or apologize for taking up space. That alone felt like a kind of miracle. Yet even now, with the king gone and the door shut between them, fear lingered beneath the warmth in her chest. He had seen enough to know she was not what the kingdom believed. Soon, everyone else would know too. By morning, the whispers would spread through the hallways, through the kitchens, through the stone corridors where servants traded rumors like coins. She could already imagine the looks, the disbelief, the sharpened curiosity. Mara drew in a slow breath and forced herself to stand. Her legs felt unsteady, as if her body still expected punishment for existing. She moved to the window and stared out into the dark grounds. Moonlight laid a pale path over the courtyard, and beyond it, the kingdom slept under a sky so clear it looked almost merciful. Somewhere out there, the king was still awake, carrying the weight of a secret that had just become larger than either of them. She touched the edge of the glass, her reflection faint and ghost-like. Not invisible, she thought. Not tonight. For the first time, that thought did not feel foolish. It felt dangerous. It felt like hope. A soft knock came at the door, so gentle that her heart nearly stopped. She turned at once, expecting a servant, a warning, another test she was not prepared to face. But when the door opened, it was not a servant who stepped inside. It was him. The king stood in the doorway with the firelight behind him, his expression unreadable and his shoulders marked by the kind of exhaustion only power could create. In one hand, he held a folded cloth. In the other, a small wooden box. He did not move closer right away. He simply watched her, as if giving her the choice to remain where she was. "I should have left this earlier," he said quietly. "I did not want you to spend the night wondering whether you were safe." Mara said nothing. Her throat had tightened at the sight of him, at the calm steadiness in his voice, at the way he looked at her, as if she mattered. He crossed the room only when she did not retreat, then set the cloth and the box on the table between them. "There is a seal in this box," he said. "If anyone comes, you press it to the door. No one will question it." Mara stared at the box. Protection, offered without condition. It was almost harder to accept than kindness had ever been. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He held her gaze, and for a moment the entire room seemed to narrow around the answer. "Because I know what it is to be hidden," he said. "And I know what it is to be judged before your truth is allowed to breathe." Her fingers tightened around the cup. He knew, not just the surface of it, not just the story she had been forced to survive, but the ache underneath it. The loneliness, the years of shrinking herself to fit the fear of others. The king looked at her with a patience that made her chest ache. "You do not need to earn safety here," he said. "You only need to stay alive until morning." The words landed softly, but they struck deeper than any command could have. Mara looked down at the cloth, at the box, at the careful way he had placed both within her reach. Not claiming, not taking, offering. She had never known power could look like that. Outside, the wind moved over the eaves in a low hush, and somewhere far away, a bell rang once through the sleeping kingdom. The sound seemed to wake the whole night. The king's head lifted slightly, his attention shifting toward the corridor beyond the door. Mara saw it at once. Something had changed. He turned back to her, and in his eyes she read the same realization that chilled her skin. The secret was no longer safe. The first whisper had already begun. Mara did not move when the first whisper reached the corridor. She only listened, her fingers tightening around the edge of the blanket, while the king stood very still beside the door, as if he could hold the night itself in place. A second murmur followed, then another, thin as smoke and just as dangerous. The sound of it made the air inside the chamber feel smaller. Mara swallowed, her mouth suddenly dry. She had lived long enough among fearful people to know the shape of trouble before it showed its face. It always arrived like this, first as a rumor, then as a door opened too quickly, then as a room turning cold around one person no one had planned to protect. The king looked toward the corridor again, and this time Mara saw the strain beneath his calm. Not fear, not weakness, a quiet calculation, sharp and deliberate, as if he were measuring how much truth the kingdom could survive in one night. "Stay here," he said, his voice low enough that it seemed meant only for her breathing. Mara looked at the cloth in her lap, then at the small box beside it. The gift felt suddenly heavier, not because it was costly, but because it was offered with such trust that it frightened her. "If they are speaking of me," she asked softly, "what will they say?" He met her eyes. "Whatever they say," he answered, "will tell me who has been lying to my face." Before she could ask what he meant, footsteps sounded beyond the door. Not hurried, controlled, the kind of steps that belonged to someone certain they were welcome. Mara felt the king shift beside her, his attention narrowing, his posture straightening with a stillness that seemed almost ceremonial. Then came the knock. 3 measured taps. A pause, and the voice on the other side was too smooth, too careful. "Your Majesty," it said, "the council requests your presence at once." Mara's heart gave a small, startled jump. The king did not answer immediately. He only looked down at her, and in that look she felt the weight of a choice being placed gently into her hands. If she stayed hidden, she would be safe for a little longer. If she came forward, the kingdom would see her. Really see her. The silence stretched until it almost hurt. Then Mara slowly set the blanket aside and rose from the chair. Her knees trembled, but she kept standing. The king watched her with an expression she could not name. Respect, perhaps, or something even more dangerous. "I am coming with you," she said. For a moment, the chamber seemed to stop breathing. Then, very quietly, he nodded. The door opened. Light spilled in from the corridor, pale and uncertain, and with it came the sound of many voices trying not to sound afraid. Mara stepped to the threshold beside the king, and when the waiting court saw her, the room changed at once. It was not loud. It was worse than loud. It was the silence of people realizing they had misjudged what stood before them. Eyes moved from her face to the king's, then back again, searching for an answer none of them had earned. At the far end of the corridor, a familiar figure stood rigid beneath the torchlight, hands folded too neatly, smile fixed in place like lacquer over fear. Mara recognized that smile. It had been worn for politeness, for pity, for every lie that had ever been called kindness. The king's hand lifted slightly, not touching her, only guiding her forward by the smallest motion, as if he wanted the whole kingdom to witness that she was no one's burden, no one's secret to hide. Mara took one careful breath, then another. The floor beneath her feet felt less like stone and more like a line she had crossed in her heart long before this moment. Behind her, the chamber door remained open. Ahead of her, the court waited. And somewhere in that waiting silence, the first true reckoning of the night began. The corridor seemed to hold its breath as Mara stepped forward, one measured pace at a time, while the court watched her as if she were the answer to a question they had spent years refusing to ask. The king did not hurry her. He only stayed beside her, calm and unshaken, his presence quiet but undeniable, like a lantern carried through fog. Mara could feel every eye searching her face, then flicking away, uncertain what to make of the girl they had dismissed so often and the man who now stood, as if her silence mattered more than all of their voices combined. The woman at the far end of the corridor kept her smile in place, but it had begun to tremble at the edges. Mara saw it. She saw the way the woman's fingers tightened at her sleeves, the way her shoulders lifted with each shallow breath. It was not courage holding her upright. It was fear pretending to be grace. Mara knew that kind of fear. She had worn it herself for too long. The king's gaze moved once to Mara, steady and respectful, as though he were asking nothing of her except the truth she had already survived. That small kindness loosened something deep inside her chest. Not enough to make her bold. Not yet. But enough to keep her standing. One of the council members shifted first, clearing his throat in a way that sounded too loud in the silence. Another looked toward the sealed doors behind them, as though wishing the night might swallow the moment before it could be spoken aloud. No one moved to stop her. No one dared. Mara reached the center of the corridor and paused beneath the torchlight, the gold glow soft against her face, turning every scar of judgment into something almost sacred. She had been taught to lower her eyes in rooms like this, to make herself smaller, to disappear before anyone could decide she did not belong. But now the king was watching her, as if she had always belonged in the very place they had denied her. Her hands trembled once, then stilled. She lifted her chin, not in defiance, but in the quiet way a person rises when they have finally stopped apologizing for existing. The woman at the end of the corridor opened her mouth as if to speak, then thought better of it. Mara noticed the hesitation, and for the first time that night, pity did not reach her. Only clarity did. This was what had been hidden from her, what had been delayed, what had been dressed up in courtesy and called mercy. Not one of them had ever wanted her truth. They had wanted her obedience, her silence, her willingness to remain grateful for scraps. But the king had brought her here to be seen, and the court, for all its polished masks, could not pretend otherwise anymore. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Then the king spoke, his voice low and even, carrying to every corner of the corridor without effort. She will not be spoken for as though she is absent. A faint ripple moved through the gathered nobles. Mara felt it in the way the air changed, in the way a few heads dipped, in the way the woman at the far end finally lost the shape of her smile. The king did not look at the others when he continued. He kept his gaze on Mara, as though she were the only person in the world whose answer mattered. If there is anything to be said tonight, he added, it will be said to her, and in full view of everyone who failed her before. The words settled over the corridor like falling snow, soft at first, then impossible to ignore. Mara's throat tightened. She had not expected justice to feel like this. Not loud, not triumphant, just steady, just true. Around her, the court began to understand that whatever story they had told themselves about her was already ending. The king lifted his hand only slightly, not to command, but to offer. Mara looked at it for one suspended moment, then placed her own hand there. His fingers closed gently around hers, warm and certain, and the entire chamber seemed to shift with that simple contact. It was not possession. It was not performance. It was recognition, the kind that made old lies look suddenly weak and small. Somewhere beyond the corridor, a bell began to ring for the night's final assembly, clear and distant, as if the castle itself were announcing that the next truth could no longer be delayed. Mara felt the sound move through her bones. The woman at the end of the hall took one involuntary step back. The king's expression did not change, but something in the set of his jaw hardened into resolve. He guided Mara forward again, not because she needed to be led, but because he wanted every watching soul to understand that she was walking into this moment by choice. And for the first time in her life, she did not feel like a shadow being carried through the dark. She felt like the beginning of a dawn no one had prepared for. The final assembly hall fell silent when Mara entered beside the king. Not because she was dressed like royalty, and not because the room had suddenly softened. It fell silent because the truth had arrived, and truth had a way of making even proud people forget how to breathe. The long tables were lit with dozens of candles, their flames trembling against polished silver and dark wood. Faces turned. Whispers started, then died, then started again like wind moving through dry leaves. Mara kept her chin level as she crossed the stone floor, but her heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. The king did not release her hand. He did not need to say a word. The way he stood beside her told the room everything it needed to know. She was not being presented. She was being honored. At the far end of the hall, the woman who had tried to bury her in silence stood rigid, her color gone pale beneath her makeup. For the first time, she had no clever words ready, no polished excuse, no one to hide behind. The court had seen enough. The lie had cracked, and in the center of that widening fracture stood Mara, still and luminous, as if the years of being overlooked had only been gathering her light for this one moment. The king lifted their joined hands just slightly, enough for every eye in the room to follow the gesture. "This is Mara," he said, his voice calm and clear. "The one you dismissed, the one you underestimated, and the one you will answer to now." The words did not thunder. They did not need to. They landed with the weight of judgment. A murmur rippled through the hall, but no one dared interrupt him. Mara felt something inside her shift, not into arrogance, but into relief so deep it almost hurt. All her life, she had been taught to lower herself so others could feel larger. All her life, she had been told that quiet women were easy to forget. But there, under the candlelight and the watching eyes, she understood that being gentle had never made her small. It had only made the wrong people blind. The king turned to face the assembled court, his expression steady, his tone unmistakable. "She speaks with my authority. She stands with my protection. And if any soul in this hall still believes she belongs beneath them, then they have mistaken kindness for weakness." Mara swallowed hard. The room seemed to tilt around her, not from fear this time, but from the strange, dizzying ache of being seen at last. The woman at the far end of the hall opened her mouth, then closed it again. No one moved. No one laughed. The old order of things was not collapsing loudly. It was simply giving way. That, somehow, felt even more powerful. Mara looked up at the king, searching his face for the hardness she had expected from men like him, from rulers who used power as a shield. Instead, she found something quieter and far more dangerous to the lies she had survived: certainty. He believed in her with no hesitation at all. And because he did, the room had no choice but to believe, too. A servant approached with a small silver circlet resting on a velvet cushion, but the king did not take it. He reached instead for the clasp at his own shoulder and removed the dark cloak from around him. The fabric was heavy, lined with a soft inner glow from the firelight. He draped it over Mara himself, careful, deliberate, as if he were placing a crown on her shoulders. The hall stirred again, but no one spoke above a whisper. Mara lowered her eyes for a second, overwhelmed by the warmth of the fabric and the meaning behind the gesture. When she looked up, the king was still watching her with that same quiet resolve. "You do not need to earn your place here," he said softly, only for her this time. "You were always worthy of it." The words entered her like light through an open door. For a moment, she could not answer. Her throat felt too tight, her heart too full. Then, in a voice that trembled only at the edges, she said, "I spent so long believing I had to disappear to be safe." His expression softened, just enough to change the whole room around him. "Not anymore," he said, and in that instant, the final shape of her fate settled into place. Not as a rescue, not as a reward, as a return to what had always been hers. The candles burned brighter. The whispering stopped. Even the distant night beyond the windows seemed to hold still, as if listening. Mara stood in the center of the great hall, cloaked in protection, wrapped in truth, and for the first time, she did not feel like someone surviving a story written by others. She felt like the one the story had been waiting for all along. The king's hand found hers again, steady and warm. Together, they turned toward the open doors where moonlight waited on the stone path outside. And as they walked forward, side by side, Mara did not look back. She did not need to. What had once tried to erase her was already fading into silence. The moon hung low over the palace gardens, spilling silver across the stone path as Mara and the king stepped into the open air together. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was not empty now. It felt full, alive, as if the night itself understood that something sacred had finally been restored. Mara's cloak stirred in the breeze, and she drew it closer around her shoulders, though she no longer felt exposed beneath it. The weight that had pressed on her for so long had begun to lift, and with every steady step beside him, the world felt less cruel, less distant, less determined to keep her small. Behind them, the great hall remained lit with candlelight, but its noise had already faded into a softer world. Here, outside beneath the open sky, everything seemed wider, truer. The king glanced at her once, his expression unreadable at first, then softened by something she could feel more than see. "You are quiet," he said. Mara let out a breath that trembled only slightly. "I am trying to understand why this feels like a dream." His hand tightened around hers, warm and certain. "Because you were never meant to live unseen," he replied. The words moved through her like warmth through winter air. She looked ahead to the dark line of the trees beyond the garden walls, to the way moonlight rested on every leaf and stone, as if blessing the path before them. For years, she had been made to feel like a mistake, like someone who had arrived in the world without permission. But now, standing beside the one person who had seen her clearly, she felt something new take root in her chest. Not triumph, not pride, something gentler, safer, the feeling of being chosen without having to beg for it. They reached the edge of the garden where the path curved toward the royal terrace, and the king slowed, turning to face her fully. Mara lifted her chin, meeting his eyes with a courage she had not always known how to claim. He studied her with a stillness that felt almost reverent, as though he was learning the shape of her in the moonlight and finding nothing in her that needed to be hidden or repaired. "There will be whispers," he said quietly. "There will always be those who forget their place when they are afraid of change." Mara almost smiled at that. It was a small, tired smile, but it was real. "Let them whisper," she said. "I have spent too many years listening to people who never meant me well." The king's gaze deepened, and for the first time that night, a faint trace of approval touched his face. Not the approval of a ruler judging a subject, but the quiet recognition of a man hearing the truth from someone he respected. Above them, the clouds thinned, and a narrow stream of moonlight fell across Mara's hands, across the ring of protection still resting there like a promise made visible. She looked down at it, then back up at him, and in that exchange there was no fear left. Only a question she did not need to speak aloud. He answered it before she could ask. "This is not the end of your story," he said. "It is the beginning of the life they tried to keep from you." Mara's breath caught softly. The words landed in the deepest part of her, where old grief still lived, and instead of hurting, they steadied her. She felt the ache of the past begin to loosen, one thread at a time, as if even sorrow had understood it could not follow her much farther. When they reached the terrace, she looked out across the kingdom. The lanterns of the city glowed in the distance like scattered stars, and beyond them the land stretched wide and patient under the night sky. It was a place that had once looked indifferent to her suffering. Tonight, it looked different. Not because the world had changed, but because she had. The king stood beside her, silent now, giving her the space to feel the full weight of what had happened. No one here would call her by old names again. No one here would look at her and see only what they had once decided she lacked. Mara exhaled slowly, and the night seemed to answer her with a cool, steady breeze. For the first time, the future did not feel like a threat. It felt like an open door. The first bell over the terrace had barely finished ringing when Mara felt the king's presence shift beside her, subtle as a change in wind. He was still not touching her, still careful, as if he had learned that even kindness could feel heavy when someone had spent too long bracing for harm. Below them, the city lanterns flickered in patient gold, and the night spread over the kingdom like a promise that had finally decided to keep itself. Mara rested both hands against the stone railing. Her fingers were steady now. That alone felt like a miracle. For so long, she had lived as if every room would shrink around her, as if every glance would find the part of her the world had chosen to call weak. But on this terrace, with the cool air brushing her face and the distant murmur of the palace settling into quiet, she could almost believe those old voices belonged to someone else. The king turned his head slightly, watching her with a patience that felt more powerful than any command. "You do not have to speak yet," he said softly. His voice was low enough that it seemed meant only for the night between them. Mara let out a slow breath. She had expected triumph to feel loud, to arrive like a parade, bright and impossible to ignore. Instead, it came like this. Quiet, measured, real. The ache in her chest did not vanish, not all at once. Some wounds were too deep for that. But they loosened, thread by thread, until she could feel something beneath them that she had not trusted in years. Relief. Maybe even safety. Far below, somewhere in the palace gardens, an evening fountain whispered against its stone basin. The sound carried upward in delicate fragments, mingling with the faint rustle of fabric as the king finally leaned one hand on the railing beside hers. Not possessive, not demanding, just there. Mara glanced at him, and for a moment she saw not the crown, not the power, not the weight of a kingdom resting on his shoulders, but a man who knew how to wait without asking her to hurry through her pain. That changed something in her more than any grand declaration could have. She had been offered words before. Promises, too. Yet none of them had mattered until now, because none of them had made space for her silence. This did. The night seemed to deepen around them, and with it came a strange, tender clarity. The future was no longer a narrow corridor lined with fear. It had opened. Not all at once, not with perfect certainty, but enough for her to take one careful step and know the ground would hold. Mara lifted her chin toward the horizon, where the last trace of dusk had faded into indigo. Somewhere out there, the kingdom would keep turning. People would wake tomorrow with their opinions and their habits and their old habits of looking away. But here, on this terrace, something had already changed. They had looked at her and expected her to bend. She had stood. They had tried to reduce her to what they thought she lacked. And now, under the watching sky, she was beginning to understand that her worth had never been theirs to decide. The king's gaze remained on the city, yet she could feel the quiet steadiness of his attention like warmth at her side. "Tomorrow," he said after a long silence, "the court will learn what respect looks like." Mara almost smiled at that, not because the promise was grand, but because it was simple. Respect. A word so ordinary it had once felt out of reach. Now it sounded like a door opening somewhere in the dark. She turned the thought over slowly, letting it settle. The past had not disappeared. It still lived in her, soft and sharp at once, but it no longer stood in front of her like a wall. It was becoming something else. A memory she had survived. A shadow behind her instead of ahead of her. And for the first time, that difference felt large enough to change everything. By morning, the palace had changed its shape in Mara's mind. It was still vast, still bright with marble and polished glass, but it no longer felt like a place built to diminish her. It felt, for the first time, like a place that might be forced to listen. She stood beside the window as the city began to wake below, her fingers resting lightly on the stone ledge. The streets were already filling with merchants, guards, and early travelers, all moving beneath the same pale sky, none of them knowing that a single conversation the night before had shifted the weight of the whole day. Behind her, the king moved with quiet certainty, giving orders in a low voice to a waiting steward. Mara caught only pieces at first. Messages sent. Seats arranged. Witnesses invited. No one excluded. The words reached her like warm sunlight breaking through a closed room. She turned slowly, watching him with a careful kind of wonder. He was not performing power. He was using it the way she had once dreamed power should be used. Not to humiliate, not to impress, but to make room. "You are doing this for the court," she said at last, her voice soft but steady. His eyes met hers, calm and unguarded. "I am doing this for the truth," he replied. "The court is only where it will be seen." The simplicity of it startled her. Truth. Seen. Heard. Words she had spent years learning to fear were now being placed, gently, into the center of the room. Mara folded her hands together to keep them from trembling. She had spent too long expecting every kindness to disappear the moment she reached for it. Yet he stood there as if patience itself were an oath, as if the world could be corrected one clear act at a time. Outside, a bell rang from the lower district, then another, and the castle seemed to inhale with the sound. Somewhere down the corridor, footsteps approached and faded again. The day was beginning, and with it came the long, uneasy work of being witnessed. Mara looked back toward the window. From this height, the city appeared almost peaceful, but she knew how quickly peace could hide a bruise. She knew how many people learned to smile through being overlooked. That thought tightened something in her chest, not with despair, but with purpose. If the court would see her today, then perhaps it would see more than her face. Perhaps it would see what the years had tried to bury. Not weakness, not shame, endurance. The kind that had carried her through hunger, through silence, through all the small cruelties that no one ever named because they seemed too ordinary to matter. And yet they had mattered. They had left marks no one could paint over. She felt the king come to stand beside her, not crowding, only present. The air shifted with his nearness, steady and composed, like a shield made of restraint. "You do not have to prove anything," he said quietly. Mara let out a breath that almost became a laugh, because the old instincts were hard to silence. Proof had once been the only language she knew. Proof she deserved a seat. Proof she was not afraid. Proof she was worth the trouble of being kind to. She had spent years making herself smaller just to survive the answers. Now he was telling her she did not need to earn a place that had already been given. "I think," she said after a moment, "that is the hardest thing to believe." His gaze softened. "Then believe it slowly." The answer settled over her with unexpected weight. Slowly, not as a command, not as a demand, as permission. Down in the courtyard, the first doors were opening. Footsteps, voices, and the rustle of morning life rose in soft layers beneath them. Mara watched a servant cross the square carrying fresh linens, then a child trailing after a parent with sleep still in her eyes. Ordinary movement, ordinary living. And somehow, that ordinary world felt more precious now, because she understood what it meant to be denied it. She had been treated as if her presence could be erased. But the king had made a choice the night before, and choices had a way of echoing. If he could stand before the court and name her worth without hesitation, then others might begin to notice what had always been there. Not a burden, not a mistake. A woman who had survived being dismissed and remained gentle anyway. Mara pressed her palm to the glass, feeling the morning cool against her skin. She thought of all the versions of herself that had come before this one. The girl who lowered her eyes, the woman who learned to speak carefully, the heart that kept beating even when no one was listening. They had all been leading her here, to this narrow space between fear and hope, where a new life had not yet arrived, but was already knocking at the door. When she finally looked at the king again, there was something in her expression that had not been there before. Not confidence, exactly. Something quieter. A readiness to be seen and not collapse beneath it. He noticed. Of course he did. And in that silence between them, she understood that respect was not only a promise he could make to a court. It was a daily thing. A practice. A way of standing beside someone without asking them to shrink. The bell sounded again, clearer this time, calling the palace to attention. Mara drew in a steady breath, feeling the day gather around her like a new skin. Whatever waited below, she would not enter it as the woman they had once tried to silence. She would enter it as herself, and this time, she would not be alone. The stairs down to the lower hall had been waiting for her, like a secret the palace was ready to keep. Mara followed the king through the quiet corridor, her hands folded so tightly at her waist that her knuckles ached. The air changed as they descended. It grew cooler, older, touched with stone and candle wax, and something else she could not name, something steady and solemn that made her breathing slow instead of quicken. At the end of the stairwell, the doors opened into a chamber she had only seen from a distance before, a place where the pack gathered for matters that shaped lives and legacies. Tonight, no one laughed here. No one looked away. The silence was complete, and in that silence Mara could feel every eye turning toward her with a careful kind of attention, as if the room itself had finally learned how to be gentle. She stepped beside the king and kept her chin level, even when old instincts told her to look down. She did not. Across the chamber, the advisors stood in a line beneath the banners, their faces arranged in the polished mask of tradition. But the king did not release her hand, not even when the first elder bowed. His thumb moved once over her knuckles, a small, anchoring touch that steadied something deep inside her. The elder began speaking about provisions for the western border and the winter stores, but Mara barely heard the words. What she noticed instead was how the king listened. He did not interrupt. He did not dismiss. He considered every voice, even the smallest one from the far end of the table, where a young servant had been sent to report the needs of the outer cottages. When that boy stumbled over his own words, the room tensed on old habit, waiting for correction. Instead, the king only said, "Take your time." The servant blinked as if no one had ever given him that before. Mara felt the impact of it in her chest. A kingdom did not change all at once. It changed in moments like that, in the way power chose to soften instead of crush, in the way a ruler used his strength to make room for someone else's voice. The discussion moved on to the village school near the river road, where the roof had begun to leak after the spring storms. One advisor suggested delay. Another suggested cutting the request entirely. Mara listened, then surprised herself by speaking. Her voice came out quiet at first, but clear. If the children are learning with water dripping over their heads, then we are teaching them that their comfort matters less than the rest of us. The room went still. She felt it then, the danger of being heard, that old tightening beneath her ribs. But the king turned toward her, and in his gaze there was no warning, only invitation. So she continued, "A repaired roof will cost less than losing their trust." For one breath, no one spoke. Then the king nodded once, slow and certain. "The repairs will be made." It was such a simple sentence, yet it carried the weight of law. Mara saw the shock move across the elders' faces before they could hide it. Not because the decision was costly, because it came from her, because her words had not been brushed aside. The chamber remained very quiet after that, as if everyone inside had to relearn the shape of respect. And Mara, standing beneath the lamplight with the king still beside her, felt something inside her settle into place. Not triumph, not revenge, something far more lasting. The knowledge that being gentle did not make her small, that being heard did not require her to harden, that the life waiting for her here might still be uncertain, but it no longer belonged to fear alone. Then the doors at the back of the chamber opened, and a messenger entered with snow on his shoulders and urgency in his eyes. He crossed the floor quickly and bowed so low that the silver clasp at his throat flashed in the light. "Your Majesty," he said, breathless, "the northern ridge has sent word. They found something in the frozen pass." The king's expression changed at once, sharpened by attention. Mara felt his hand tighten around hers, not in alarm, but in warning. Whatever had been found in the pass, it had been waiting in the cold for someone to come looking. And as the messenger lifted his gaze, Mara saw the look in his face and understood that the day had not finished revealing itself yet.